Well, thank you. It's always good to be back with the Lessiter audience and the no-till farmer folks. And we just wanted to spend a little time talking about residue decay and the interaction it has with fall covers and getting those crops started. I was looking back, and I think we did our first no-till farmer webinar in March of 2013. And we talked about the basics of biologicals and what types of biologicals there are, when they work, when they don't work. And our second one was in September of that year, and we talked about residue decay. And we've about half the webinars we've done since then have been on residue decay, but there are new topics that keep coming up related to this. And so the purpose of this webinar is to talk about some of those new topics that we keep seeing from our customers and from other farmers, and that's why we're here, and we hope it's helpful. Basically, in the previous webinars, we've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the different types of residue, components of residue, how much residue's in the field, how it breaks down, what factors influence it, how you can accelerate it, all kinds of good stuff. But these new questions keep coming up, and so today we'll talk about those. So if you want to, but the purpose of all of our previous talks is been to focus on the value of the nutrients in residue decay and different crop sources, because especially in the last few years when fertilizer sources have been tight and expensive if you can get it, there is a lot of value in crop residue. And so we focused in the past on how much value you can release from residue by accelerating the decay process, and how you can go about that. So that's old ground. But the purpose today is to talk about managing that process while you're also starting to raise cover crops, because cover crops can contribute a lot. I'm not going to talk about all those benefits particularly, because the folks at Lessiter do such a good job through Conservation Tillage Guide and the No-Till Farmer publications and the National No-Till Conference and things like that. But we do want to talk about the interaction between releasing those nutrients and all of the great things that can happen from residue decay while you're trying to get the benefits of the cover crops. Now, the interesting thing to note is we have a very similar transition that occurs in the spring as we're trying to terminate a cover crop that's grown into the spring, unless it was winter killed, and then get ready to plant and start out a cash crop. A lot of those same interactions happen, but people have focused on a lot of those parts and the dimensions of that problem, but have not focused as much on the fall issues. In the fall, most of the attention's been on, one, what type of cover crops should I grow? Two, when should I seed them? And three, how am I going to seed them? So should I use rye? Should I use a mix? Should I use brassicas, clovers, etc.? Should I plant them early? Should I interseed? For example, should I rig up a high boy sprayer and blow cover crop seed into standing corn so I can get it started before that crop is harvested? Should I wait? Should I use a drill? Should I fly it on? All of those things are important factors, but yet there's a relationship between that residue decay process that's beginning right after harvest and the start of those cover crops that's pretty important. And a lot of the questions we're getting over the next, especially the last couple of years, are about that transition. That whole process is pretty important to manage, because in addition to recycling those nutrients, the residue decay process helps build soil organic matter. So you increase your water holding capacity, nutrient bonding capacity. You get a field like this, a nice no-till corn crop planted into corn residue. This crop's off to a good start, but some of them are hampered by some of the problems that come along with having that undecayed residue. You can have emergence issues. That residue, if it's really thick and heavy, can hamper soil warming and drying in the spring. You can also have mechanical problems. That residue can bunch up and cause problems with your planter openers and abrade tires and other equipment problems. And so it in addition to recycling those nutrients and building soil organic matter, it's really helpful to reduce the volume of that residue just so you can get the next crop planted without having trouble. And then the other thing is that the residue is a place that provides habitat for insects and plant diseases that can come back and bite you later in the season. So there is value in trying to manage that process and achieve all these good benefits that come about by breaking down that residue. You don't want to get rid of all of it right away. You do want to leave some cover to protect the soil from wind and water erosion. But as we've talked in the past, crop residue, whether it's corn stalks or wheat straw or anything else, tends to break down from the inside out. The decay organisms attack the easiest sugars to get to first, and that tends to be the pith in the center of the stalk, which is cellulose, and then they leave the outer shell, which tends to be harder material, higher lignin content, and that can remain as cover to protect that soil over the winter. But then when you start running equipment again in the spring, it's decomposed enough that it will break down and not cause trouble with tires and openers and other things later in the season. In terms of value, we've talked about this in the past, but there is a fair amount of content per dry ton of corn stalks, soybean residue, small grain residue. Corn has a fair amount of nitrogen and potash. Soybean residue is generally more valuable on a per ton basis because it's got a lot more nitrogen than corn residue. And even oat straw and wheat straw have quite a bit of potash as well, and nearly as much nitrogen as corn. We tend to focus on this for small grain residue because a lot of that straw is hauled off and used as bedding or for other purposes, and it's important to account for that value when it's removed. But even the stubble that remains at the bottom of those plants and into the root system has nutrient value that can be recaptured and recycled for the next crop. Every season, we gather commercial fertilizer prices from several sources. We look at anhydrous, 28 and 32%, MAP, DAP, etc., and put a price per pound on each one of those nutrients and add it up. So NPK and sulfur for corn residue tends to come out at about $35 per ton. Recently, it was much higher just a few years ago. Again, soybean residue tends to be more valuable because of the additional nitrogen in it. And even oat straw and wheat straw have roughly a $35 per ton value that you can recapture and accelerate, especially when fertilizer prices are high. And that can reduce your purchased input costs, as well as capturing all of those other benefits from accelerating the decay of the residue and managing that process. A couple other things to keep in mind. The process is largely driven by fungal species. So anything you do to hurt your fungal species in the soil is going to slow down residue decay. As folks in the no-till community know, tillage has a big impact on fungal species. And unlike bacteria, which can recover from anything that harms those colonies, they'll recover in a few weeks. It takes months for the fungal species to recover. And so tillage events, excessive use of certain chemicals or fertilizer products that will hurt fungus can slow down residue decay. And as well, the whole process is driven largely by the amount of residue and its carbon-nitrogen ratio. That leads to our first question. When managing the transition from one crop to another, in trying to decay fall residue and transition into your fall cover system, do I have enough nitrogen? That's a pretty important question. Years ago, before people started adopting covers or readopting covers on a widespread basis, we didn't really face this issue. And we've been in business since 1981, so we have quite a bit of experience. And it's just in the last 5 or 10 years that we've had more questions about, do I have enough nitrogen? Should I put on additional N in the fall to help my residue decay process? And especially if you're growing covers, that's a really important question. Carbon nitrogen ratio tells us how much nitrogen is available in the residue, and it varies a lot. Down in the lower right corner, we have microbes at 8:1. So as you ramp up those microbial colonies for the decay process, for each 8 units of carbon they require to build their cell structure, they're going to use 1 unit of nitrogen. And that's to form proteins and other things, just like we need as we grow and maintain our body structure. So that nitrogen comes either from soil sources, leftover available nitrogen at the end of the season, or from the residue source that's being decomposed. Everything in the right-hand column, from rye cover on down to clover, has relatively low carbon to nitrogen ratios, meaning that it's relatively rich in nitrogen. And those crop residues break down pretty easily because it doesn't require a lot of additional N. If you look at soybean residue, 20:1, basically you're not going to need any additional nitrogen to break that down beyond what's already in the residue. And clovers, brassicas are typically about the same as clovers or even lower. Some of them are 10:1. So those residues break down pretty easily. And rye cover that's 12, 16 inches tall, when it's terminated, doesn't have a lot of stem material, doesn't have a lot of lignin to it. It's relatively rich in nitrogen, and it breaks down pretty easily. It's those tougher, stemmier, higher carbon residues on the left column that can cause problems, and that's where we have to think about using some additional nitrogen. Corn stalks, for example, 60:1, if you go through the carbon cycling math, and we've done that in previous webinars, you're going to tie up an additional roughly 13 pounds for each ton of residue that's being decayed. So if you take a typical fall in most parts of the Midwest and you get harvested by roughly 1st of October, you're going to have about 6 weeks of decay weather left before things get too cold. And you could easily decay about a quarter of the material that's out there, roughly 2.5 tons of corn residue, yet in the fall before things freeze up. And so you might be in need of somewhere between 25 and 30 pounds of nitrogen to ramp up those microbial colonies and get that job done. As it turns out, most people are going to have most of that available nitrogen available after the previous crop. So there's not usually a problem in available nitrogen if you're just looking at residue decay. If you're planting a cover crop at the same time, depending on what kind of cover it is, you may run short. Especially if you get into situations where you've got rye straw. So now we're looking more to a spring situation. If you let your rye go to close to the head stage, and so it's mostly mature when you terminate, either by roller crimper or you sprayed it, whatever you did. A lot of people like to roll that down, plant into it as a mat. That provides cover to reduce weeds, helps control moisture, but it also has to be broken down. And that rye straw, because it's relatively poor in nitrogen, is going to need about 25 or 26 pounds per ton. And if you let it go out to close to the head stage before it was terminated, you might have 4 or 5 tons of residue out there in that field. And so you're going to tie up quite a bit of nitrogen that next crop needs, while you're also trying to break down that straw mat that you provided to get the crop started. So you can end up short on nitrogen if you're trying to start a cover crop in the fall at the same time you're decaying residue, or in the spring if you're trying to break down that cover residue while you're starting your next cash crop. And so it used to be we told people, well, you really don't need any additional nitrogen to break down corn stalks. But as more and more people have adopted covers, that's become an interesting question, and the nitrogen issue has come into play. You might be short on nitrogen and hamper both your fall cover development and your residue decay process if you didn't apply as much spring nitrogen. And so you basically ran out during the season. And that happened in the last few years. If people weren't able to get as much nitrogen as they wanted, weren't willing to pay the extremely high prices that existed, they may have shorted themselves on nitrogen just because that was the thing you had to do to get going that year. And often you see that in the plants late in the season. If they're short on nitrogen to fill out the crop, they're going to cannibalize those stalks, and you'll start to see stalk decay before full maturity because it's taken it from its own structure. And the other case is if you've had very heavy rainfalls and you've leached a lot of nitrogen through the season, and so you end up shorter than you would normally be by harvest time. If you're trying to start a rye cover or some other grass cover, you may need roughly 15 to 25 pounds of N per acre just to get that stuff up to the 9 to 12, maybe 15 inch of growth. And at the same time, if you're decaying a couple of tons of corn residue and you need 25 to 30 pounds, next thing you know, you're looking at 45 to 60 pounds of N. And if you don't have that much available in the field, you're going to slow down your residue decay, and you're going to slow down the development of that cover. And accordingly, you won't develop as much biomass and all the benefits you can get from the cover, and you won't recycle your nutrients and get all the other benefits of the residue decay process that you might get. And so it may pay to add a little bit of fall nitrogen to support both of those activities, residue decay and starting fall covers, so that you make sure that all the good things happen. And so that's a case that's come up in the last few years where, we used to say you got enough nitrogen in the field, but now if you're asking it to do double duty and you're putting out rye or other grass covers, you may need some additional nitrogen. And we've seen a lot more high rainfall events in the last few years. So it hasn't happened this year so much in our area, but we have had cases where you get 3-4 inches of rain in a short period of time, and you probably lost some N. It's not going to be available to you at the end of the season. Very last thing we'll just hit on is the role of temperature and moisture. We've talked about this in the past. But it's important in the fall to keep in mind that the whole process, both the germination process for covers and the decay process, are driven by moisture and temperature. In terms of microbial activity, if we look at CO2 respiration, which is one way to measure microbial activity, it peaks out around 75 to 80 degrees, and this is surface temperature. So we're talking about activity in the very top level of the soil layer at these temperatures. The other thing is the moisture tends to be best at about 75 to 80% of field capacity. Drops off after that because you got less air available for the aerobic microbial processes. And of course, if it's dry and you're low field capacity, there's going to be less microbial activity. And then as far as temperature, it tends to peak out at about 85 to 90 degrees surface temperature. Microbial activity varies. Some microbes are more active at lower temperatures. Some are more active at higher temperatures. But in terms of total activity, it's more or less dormant once you get down below about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ramps up pretty fast, so it will roughly double as you increase temperature by 10 degrees. So as you go from 40 to 50, it doubles. 50 to 60, it doubles. Tends to plateau or slow down at about 75. It plateaus at about 90. And then as that temperature gets really warm, 95, 100 higher, microbial activity goes back toward a more dormant state. Again, some microbes are going to be more active at warmer temperatures, but in terms of total activity, it's going to tail off pretty fast as you get really, really warm. And so the temperature moisture interaction for cover crop germination is very similar to what you see for residue decay. If you've got cool temps, dry conditions, or extremely wet conditions, both processes, decay and growth of your covers, is going to be hampered. And so that's important to keep in mind. One question that has come up a lot in the last few years is, hey, if I'm doing something to accelerate or push my residue decay program in the fall, and I'm also sowing cover crop seed, aren't I shooting myself in the foot? Won't I just go ahead and decay my cover seeds, and I'll have a poor stand, and I'll be wasting money and effort? There is some logical basis for that, because crop seeds are plant material, and if you can decay stalks and cobs and husks, you can decay seeds. In fact, we've seen cases where we've been able to help people control weeds and reduce volunteer corn by decaying weed seeds in the seed bank in the soil, and by decaying dropped ears and other things. And so why doesn't that work on cover crop seeds? Again, a question we used to not get very often, but as people are more interested in covers and also interested in the benefits of accelerated decay, it looks like those two processes are going to bump up against one another. And yet we've never had that problem. It kind of surprised us when we first started to get it, because in over 40 years of experience, we've rarely seen any problems where accelerated residue decay has any negative impact on establishing fall cover, whether it's rye or clovers or brassicas or something else. But we did thought we better look into this and check it. So what we did was we ran a series of experiments in our soil health lab. In thinking about this, the key difference between crop residue, which is dead plant material, and seeds that you're putting in the ground at the same time, is the dormancy character of the seeds. Crop seeds are genetically selected for certain traits. Easy germination is one of those traits. And consequently, the dormancy character of seeds selected for particular genetic traits, including easy germination, are going to tend to have more limited dormancy. And so they come out of dormancy easily, they germinate easier. And the agronomy literature, there is a small literature on this, but there have been people who've researched the relationship between residue decay and seed decay in the field. They've all pointed to the fact that in general, non-dormant seeds are going to outgrow the decay process, and the decay organisms won't catch up to your seeds. As long as the field conditions are right. If the seeds are planted in dry soil, or it turns cold and there's not enough temperature, then there are issues. But again, when you get into those conditions, your residue decay process also slows down. So the decay activity will be less in drier, cooler soils, and consequently, those seeds can lay out there for a while. They won't decay. And if conditions change, you do get the moisture you need, or that warms up to the point where they will germinate, the good things will happen. Typically, where you run into trouble is if you plant them into soils that are going to remain dry or remain cold for a long period of time, and then the seeds go back into dormancy where they're more subject to decay. There are also pathogenic microbes out there, the sorts of things that we use fungicides and other seed treatments to protect against. But in terms of decay organisms, they're not going to attack non-dormant seeds, because those seeds are typically going to germinate much faster than they'll decay. they will be subject to decay if they do go back into dormancy. And so if you put out cover seeds in dry or cool conditions and that doesn't change, then as those seeds go back into dormancy, they might decay. But typically, if you're planting in a situation where they've got a good chance to germinate because there's adequate moisture, adequate temperature, conditions are good enough to get them germinated, they're going to outrun the decay organisms, and you don't have any problem by accelerating decay at the same time you're trying to get your covers started. Now, different crop seeds will behave in different fashions. So, for example, native plant seeds. If I bought a set of native plant seeds from a nursery a few years ago, and they pointed out that some of those seeds, have very hard, thick seed coats, and they have to imbibe a lot of water and go through several freeze-thaw cycles before they'll germinate. Other seeds have to be exposed to heat. So things like prairie fires years and years ago, or they have to be, the seed coats have to be abraded by freeze-thaw cycles where the mineral matter abrades the outer shell of the seed. It can take up to 3 years to germinate some of that seed. And that's, again, genetically selected for that. Those seedlings had to survive on the prairies hundreds and thousands of years ago. So that's how they evolve. But the seeds we select for crops have the opposite character. They're easily germinated because they've got very limited dormancy. Another interesting case we've talked about is the fact that palmer, amaranth, pigweed, and water hemp are a real problem in lots of parts of the country. Those plants can put out hundreds of thousands of seeds, but the neat thing is those seeds are relatively small and they've got thin seed coats, so they can be easily decayed. The other neat thing about it is that they've got a very long dormancy period where you can actually actively decay those seeds. There's about a 10 to 12 week period where they have to go through a cold dormancy before they can germinate, and then they don't germinate until temperatures are relatively warm. Plants in that family are classified as late summer annuals, and they typically need about 70-degree temperatures to germinate. So if you can get them while they're in their dormancy and decay part of that weed seed bank, you'll have less weed pressure. And we've actually seen that on farms. Once they've germinated, they grow very fast, and typically at that point, your spring chemical programs run out, and that's where you've got to be out in the field and catch them in those very early stages, or else it's lost. But there is a window earlier in the season when biological activity can take care of those seeds. And to me, the dormancy relationship's fascinating. It depends on the crop, it depends on weather conditions, but in terms of commercial seed, we're going to plant for covers or cash crops. We don't have those issues. So to test this claim that, hey, maybe I should be concerned about putting cover crop seeds at the same time I'm trying to decay residue, we said, well, we got to test it out. We have a product. We typically don't do a lot of product stuff in our webinars, but just to explain what we did, we applied BioCat 1000, which is our residue decay product. It's intended to multiply the fungal species in the soil, ramp up that residue decay process, and break down the residue faster than it would without boosting those fungal populations. It's a liquid. You can put it on with fall burn down chemicals, liquid fertilizers. You can put it on by itself. And we've talked about all the good things that happen with advanced residue decay in other webinars. But what we did was we took soil samples and treated half of them with BioCat 1000 to ramp up the decay activity, and the rest of them we left untreated and planted rye cover seeds in both sets of samples to see, did the accelerated residue decay process generated by this product have an impact? And so what we did was we just used a very common soil type for our area. It was a silt loam farm soil. Was not no-till, so it was conventionally farmed. The soil had not had manure in over 40 years, and it had never received any biological treatments. So it provided a good test case. We took all of the samples and used the Solvita burst test to measure their base level of biological activity. Burst test measures CO2 respiration in an enclosed container at a constant temperature and moisture for 24 hours. So we sampled all of the test beds and got our base level of biological activity. Then we treated half the samples at 8 times the field rate. We wanted to make sure that those decay organisms were active and they had every chance to attack the cover crop seeds if something was going to happen. So we basically used the equivalent of a gallon per acre of BioCat 1000 to make sure that things were working and there was every chance for the seedlings to be, or seeds and seedlings to be affected by the decay organisms. And then after that product had a chance to work for 1 week, we went back and retested using the Solvita burst test later to see how much activity was generated. Based on the CO2 results from the burst test, the control had a pretty good level of CO2 respiration, but the treated had 81% more activity among the decay organisms. So we had initiated more decay activity in those treated samples. We then went and planted commercial rye seeds. We bought it from a farm supplier. It had a tag germination rate of 85%, which was, pretty standard for commercial rye seed, annual rye, that is. We kept the samples moist after we seeded each test soil sample. Kept them at about 62 degrees Fahrenheit. We didn't vary the temperature throughout the day, but we maintained the same temp, basically representing a good common fall temperature. That's kind of the ideal temperature for rye germination. And we did vary daylights, so we had light on and off using grow lights, 12 hours on, 12 hours off per day. And then after 3 weeks, we went back to the samples and clipped all of the seedlings. We first counted seedlings, and the control group, those without the treatment, had 81% germination, so just a little bit under what you'd expect based on the tag seed rate or germ rate. And then the treated actually had a higher germ rate, so there was no evidence that the accelerated residue decay hurt the germination. This was a statistically significant difference, but it was in the favor of the treated soil. So there was no decline or diminished impact of germination by accelerating residue decay at the same time you're trying to get that cover seed started. We also looked to see, did it have any impact on the early seedling growth? And so after about 3 weeks, all the seedlings some of them were 5-6 inches, some were less, but the average was about 2.5 inches treated and controlled. There again, there was slight advantage for the treated samples, but 0.06 of an inch, I'm going to argue, is not really that much to worry about. So there was effectively no difference. And so consequently, what we concluded was that accelerating residue decay at the same time you're trying to start that rye cover doesn't have any impact, and that's squared with all of the evidence we'd seen in the field from the last 40 years. We haven't had anybody tell us that starting a residue decay program in the fall had any impact on their cover crop program. Because dormancy matters so much, we are continuing this research. We've tried clovers and we've tried mustard, which is a part of the brassica family. We haven't seen any difference. The next thing we're going to do is we're getting our hands on some water hemp seed, and we're going to try our hand at decaying weed seeds. And so we're going to continue this research program for a while, but at least based on rye, no impact. So we learned something. We already knew that, but because of the number of questions we were getting, we felt it was important to look into this issue. And we think these results kind of support our experience over the last several years out in the field. And so the key difference is that dormancy cycle. If you're planting non-dormant seed, they're going to take off as long as you've got ample moisture and temperature. And the other thing to note is if you're planting seeds into dry soils, hoping for moisture later, or you plant them in a cool snap and you're hoping for warmer weather later, what's slowing down that germination process is also going to slow down your residue decay process. So while those seeds are sitting there waiting for better conditions, your decay organisms are also not going to be very active. And they will ramp up once the seeds get the moisture and temperature they need. But at that point, the seeds are going to outrun the decay organisms in general, and so again, it won't matter. The only real risk is if you plant them into conditions that do not improve and those seeds go back into dormancy, then they are subject to decay during that dormancy period. So what have we learned? Again, we've tried to focus on managing the transition between cash and cover crops. In the fall, we have this similar problem in the spring as you're starting a cash crop and trying to terminate and decay your covers. But in the fall, we've had more and more questions about some of these issues related to the role of nitrogen, related to potential bad interchange between decay and cover crop seeds. What we've learned is nitrogen does matter. Crop conditions in the field matter, especially temperature and moisture. And because of the role of dormancy in the seed process, the things we worry about usually don't come about. So with that, I'll conclude, and we can start any questions.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Doug. And thanks, everybody, for bearing with us at the beginning there as we straightened out some technical difficulties. Just a reminder, we do have time for question and answer now. So if you have any questions, you can submit them through that little Q&A icon on your screen, and then I will read the question to Doug and get you an answer as best as we can. We did have one question come in so far. So, Doug, if you're ready, I'll read this one off to you.
Okay.
Question is, do you recommend a certain soil nitrate level or test when using a fall cover crop? And he says, as an example, maybe like oats.
Do I recommend a certain test or a certain level?
Well, it's a certain soil nitrate level, and then in parentheses, test.
Okay. Well, as far as levels, again, for oats, you'd be looking at about, again, needing at least about 15 to 25 pounds of N to get the oats started. And so, you can look at your available nitrate levels to see if you've got that left over. So a test early in the fall to check your nitrate levels after you're done producing corn or whatever crop you've had on that field. And then I would use a nitrate test for that. So I hope that answers the question.
All right. And then I had another one roll through just now. Question is there any current literature on the research done on decaying Palmer amaranth and water hemp seeds?
If there is, it's really new. Most of the literature focuses on other species. And again, there's not a huge literature. Search the agronomy literature pretty extensively. And they've focused on other seeds, not Palmer, pigweed, water hemp. And most of the research we have is based on really anecdotal stuff from individual farms. We've had people that are central Illinois. They've been facing pressure from those weeds for over 10 years now, and they've been able to control it. They don't have clean fields, but they're relatively clean compared to a lot you see. And so in digging into that family, it's really fascinating. But you do have the potential to decay those seeds because of their long cool dormancy requirement, and their high temperature for germination requirements. So there is a window where you can decay those seeds, and we've had people that report success with it. As far as lab results, we're working on that now. But in terms of other published research, if it's come out, it's been really recent.
All right. Well, looks like that's all we've got. I'm sure if you think of any other questions, you know where to submit those to us at No-Till Farmer. You can also shoot them over to us via email, and we'll make sure we get them to Doug and get you an answer. But just want to go ahead and thank everyone for joining us today, and wanted to remind everyone that, as usual, the presentation will become available for replay on the No-Till Farmer website. Usually takes about 24 to 48 hours. So just look out in your email. You'll get a notification there once that does become available. And just one more thank you to Midwest Biotech for joining us. And thanks to you, Doug, for a great presentation.
Well, thank you guys.